Okay, so Henry taught Ribsy to fetch the paper, and the next morning, Ribsy went out and fetched all the papers from Clickitat Street, and Henry had scooped them up early in the morning and dropped them off on Scooter's porch, and then ran back home and was relieved not to have been caught. Henry felt unusually cheerful after his narrow escape and was enjoying a second helping of pancakes when the doorbell rang. Ding dong! Mr. Huggins answered it, and Henry heard Scooter say, "Here's your paper, Mr. Huggins. I'm sorry it was late." Holding his breath, Henry looked at the breakfast table, strewn with the Sunday Journal. Mr. Huggins said, "There must be some mistake, Scooter. We already have our paper." "You have?" Scooter sounded surprised. "You're the only people on Clickitat Street that have one." "Henry, where'd you find the newspaper this morning?" asked Mr. Huggins. "On the doormat." Well, he had found it on the doormat. His father didn't ask what else he had found, did he? "Oh, it sure is funny," repeated Scooter. "I know I delivered all the papers, but... Well, thanks anyway, Mr. Huggins. It sure is odd." "Oh, jeepers," thought Henry. Now he had done it. Why hadn't he thought of putting his own paper on Scooter's doormat with the others? Now Scooter would get suspicious and might figure out what had happened. Mr. Huggins folded back the sports section. "Isn't it funny that Scooter's papers should disappear from Clickitat Street?" he remarked to no one in particular. "When I used to deliver papers when I was a kid, I had a lot of trouble with dogs stealing them." Henry looked sharply at his father, but Mr. Huggins appeared to be interested in the baseball scores in the newspaper. "What'd you do about it, Dad?" asked Henry, as if he were just making polite conversation. "Well, I sprinkled red pepper on the papers for a while until the dogs learned to leave them alone," answered Mr. Huggins, pouring himself another cup of coffee. After breakfast, Henry waited till his mother had finished the dishes. Then he quietly found the can of red pepper and an old newspaper and called Ribsy out into the backyard, where he was sure Scooter wouldn't see him. He rolled up the newspaper, sprinkled it with red pepper, and threw it out on the grass. Ribsy ran over to it, stopped, and sniffed. He walked all the way around the newspaper, sniffing. Then he rolled it over with his paw before he carefully, by one end, picked it up and dropped it at Henry's feet. He wagged his tail and looked pleased with himself. "Oh, you old dog," said Henry angrily. Ribsy jumped up on Henry and looked so eager Henry couldn't help but giving him some pats. "Oh, what am I going to do with you anyway?" he asked. Then he sprinkled hot pepper on the paper again and tossed it into the grass. Ribsy bounded after it. Again, he sniffed it, and he rolled the paper with his paw before he picked it up carefully and carried it back to Henry. Henry had a feeling that although hot peppers might work with other dogs, it wasn't going to work with Ribsy. Anyway, he couldn't follow two paper boys around the neighborhood and sprinkle pepper on every single newspaper they delivered, could he? And then there was the shopping news, another newspaper besides. He'd end up spending all the money he'd saved for his bike just buying hot peppers. Henry sat down to think of another way to untrain Ribsy. He couldn't keep the dog shut in the house alone very long, because he'd howl and scratch on the doors to get out. Mrs. Huggins didn't like scratches on her woodwork, and the neighbors didn't like to hear Ribsy howling. He couldn't tie the dog up either. It never took Ribsy long to chew through a rope or a leash. Henry tried to think about what Ribsy didn't like. He didn't like to have his tail pulled. Henry thought about pulling his tail every time he picked up a paper, but that would hurt Ribsy. Ribsy didn't like the egg he was supposed to eat once a week, so he'd have a shiny fur, but Henry didn't see how he could give him an egg every day he stole the newspaper. Henry couldn't think of anything else Ribsy didn't like except baths. Ribsy was really a very happy-go-lucky, agreeable dog. While Henry was still trying to think of a way to untrain Ribsy, he heard Scooter calling. He quickly put the pepper and the paper inside the back door and ran around the house. What would he say if Scooter guessed? "Hi, sure is funny how you got a paper when nobody else on the street did, isn't it?" "Yeah," said Henry, wondering how he could change the subject. "And you know what?" asked Scooter. "What?" said Henry, knowing very well what. "I know I delivered those papers. And when I got home, I found 16 papers on my porch." "Jeepers!" Henry did his best to look surprised. "Oh, man, why couldn't a fire engine or something come down Klickitat Street right now?" He heard the jingle of Ribsy's license tag. The dog trotted around the corner of the house, and after scratching, settled himself at Henry's feet. Then he suddenly sat up and looked toward the Grumby's house next door. Henry looked too, and what he saw gave him a terrible, sinking feeling in his stomach. There, in plain sight on the front steps, lay the Grumby's copy of the Oregonian, a newspaper. Ribsy jumped to his feet, and Henry knew he had to do something in a hurry, or Ribsy would go retrieve the Grumby's paper before Scooter's very eyes. Oh, shuddering at the thought of what would happen if he did, Henry hastily grabbed his dog around the neck. "Oh, good old Ribsy," he said, hanging on tight. Ribsy squirmed. Henry wished as hard as he could that Scooter would go home. "If anything happens to the papers tomorrow afternoon, I guess I better not go away for scout camp," said Scooter. "If I lose my paper route, I won't have the money to go to camp during summer vacation." Henry didn't answer. He was too busy trying to hang on to Ribsy without looking as if he were holding on to Ribsy. Ribsy strained toward the Grumby's newspaper. Henry turned his dog's head in the opposite direction, but the minute he let go, Ribsy whimpered and tried to get at the paper. "What's the matter with that dog of yours, anyway?" asked Scooter. "Why don't you let him go?" "He doesn't want to go," said Henry. "Do you, Ribsy?" Ribsy whimpered and struggled to get out of Henry's arm. Henry couldn't see why Scooter had to hang around so long anyway. Why couldn't he just go home? Henry tried not to look at the newspaper on the Grumby's front steps, but it was all he could think about. Then the Grumby's front door opened, and Mr. Grumby, wearing his bathrobe and slippers, walked sleepily out on the porch, picked up the newspaper, and went into the house again. Ribsy relaxed, and Henry let go of him. Whew, that was close. Henry looked anxiously up and down the street to see if he could see any other newspapers. Instead, he saw Beezus and her little sister, Ramona. The two girls stopped in front of Henry's house. Beezus had a handful of waxed paper. Ramona had a red plastic water pistol. She looked at Scooter, aimed, and shot a stream of water into his face. "You're dead," she announced. "I am not. Would you cut that out?" Scooter wiped his face with his shirt sleeve. "Ramona, Stop that, or I'll have to take the toy away from you, ordered Beezus. Henry, come on over to the park with us. I've got a bunch of bread wrappers to sit on while we slide on the slides. Okay, said Henry, promptly, more because he wanted to get away from Scooter than because he wanted to go to the park. Still, it was a long time since he had waxed the slides by sitting on a bread wrapper. Here, Ribsy, he called. Let me just check our time here. And that is about 10 minutes, which is about how long these videos should be so that they will upload properly. We will find out what happens with Scooter, Ribsy, the newspapers, Beezus, and Ramona in the park tomorrow. All right, see you later.